new individual coming into the workforce, what advice would you give to them?
So let's first kind of, I say narrow it down, but obviously it's
Artin Nazarian is a seasoned executive with nearly 2 decades at the Walt Disney Company. After founding and successfully exiting a tech startup, he became a best-selling author and now co-hosts a podcast dedicated to helping aspiring founders. Michael Merrill, a former Disney and Netflix executive, transitioned from corporate life to entrepreneurship to fast-track others' careers.
you have to know what your goals are first. If your goals are, I want to climb to be the CEO in the C-suite of a Fortune 100, 500 company, then remote first and only being remote might take a very long time for you to get there. If a high performer is remote and a high performer is hybrid or in office and rubbing shoulders with senior leadership on a regular basis, they will get the promotion first, 100%.
I think what Andy is trying to really capture when he tries to get people back into Amazon, because the argument you made of doing that every other week, well, I think he feels... Amazon CEO Andy Jassy has announced that starting January 2nd, 2025, corporate employees will be required to return to the office 5 days a week. This decision marks a shift from the previous hybrid model that required 3 days in the office per week. Is this the beginning of the end of remote work, or is Amazon making a big mistake? Let us know below. And Artin, what do you think?
No, it's definitely not end the remote work. I think it's just different strategies I think companies are starting to use for different reasons. Obviously there's the somewhat controversial reason that, is this a way to bypass layoffs and severance packages and see how many people voluntarily leave? I don't know if that's what Amazon is doing. I hope not, because you would think, these big companies could be more ethical, but at the same time, there's always, unethical stuff happening at these big corporations. So you never know. But I definitely don't think it's the end of remote work. I just think companies are struggling to figure out how to lead in this new world. So the fallback is, let's go back to pre-pandemic because it worked. So why not try it again?
So Andy, though, pretty smart guy, built out AWS, and literally the cash cow for the business. And obviously he's continued to grow the other sides of Amazon as well. Do you think he is incapable to build a culture that can actually manage remote employees?
I don't think he's incapable, but it's not a one-man job. It's a brand new culture you have to build. And when a company like Amazon is so massive, it's really hard to shift the culture and to train leaders to lead with a remote hybrid model, mindset first.
But it was a decision. It's obviously a decision that they believe that this is I don't want to call it the path of least resistance, but somehow the decision now is, you know what, instead of trying to shape the company in that way, let's go ahead and just tell everybody they need to return to the office. It's going to have some ramifications. And I've already heard actually a lot. I know several people who've worked there who are like, we're out. Some of them I know who've already given their notice. Like literally they're like, nope, that's the straw that broke the camel's back. I'm out of here. Don't you think there's a chance that it's going to cause a brain drain at Amazon?
For sure. I think it's going to backfire where you might think you could weed out low performers or difficult folks. You might weed out your high performance. And long term, it might be an interesting short-term strategy.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's a good long-term strategy because these high performers are very easily going to land somewhere that they're wanted with the flexibility or the perks that they want. Because it's out there. You just have to look for it. It might not be a mega Amazon, but it might be a company quarter size of Amazon.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. Top performers always have other options, and people are going to hire them quickly, and they're going to have the negotiation power to be able to say, I want to be able to work remote. I mean, be it remote 3 days a week, hybrid, or be it, the permanent remote thing. This is where I should have the pitch ready for my program, helping top performers stand out, but who knows? Yeah. We'll link it below. Anyways, so Art, I'm curious though, in your own personal opinion, if you were building a company today, would you build a company that was remote first, or where would you lean into that scale of no remote to fully remote?
If I was building a company today, which we are
It's
attempting to do,
yeah.
It would 100% be remote first. Especially if it's somehow the internet and online is involved, it will be 100% remote first. If you're building, I don't know, a law office or a medical practice, different story. But most businesses, I think today, should start with remote first in mind. Especially, I mean, there's so many benefits to it. One, when you're starting a business, you're probably strapped for cash and you're trying to be very frugal. Well, if you live in high cost of living cities like LA and New York, it might be a barrier for you to actually start a
Yeah.
company. But if you could just remotely tap into talent anywhere in the world, whether in the United States or outside, it just gives you an edge to actually start something and see if you could build it into a revenue generating company versus not even trying because you never had the talent, access to the talent and the cash to even begin with. So 100%, I would start remote first. Sure, you would have to adjust certain things and probably invest more time as you start hiring and you build a team. You have to invest more time in culture and how to lead 100% on staff teams. Like, to me, that's what the new leaders of tomorrow are going to be need to do.
And do you think that's a specialized training that they require? Do you think it's just the nature of good leaders are automatically leaning into this and trying to understand what their employees need? Like, what's the gap there? Why are people struggling to close it?
No, I don't think that leaders are just switching something in their brain and saying, oh, okay, I'm going to lead this way now. I definitely think training is needed, and a lot of it is mindset shifts, where that mindset of butts on seats doesn't equal productivity. Like, that was a very old school way of leading, I think, where you would walk around the office and say, is everybody in their cubicles in their office? That's not going to work these days. So how do you make sure that people are productive and the best they can be? I also think that, there's different types of leadership. You could be kind of that visionary coaching leadership. You could be kind of a democratic leadership. You could be an authoritarian leadership. So there's different leadership styles. I think that coaching visionary style leadership is what is going to do well in this new world, because that type of leader is going to spend the time to coach and train and build up people in the right way. So there's a sense of community that happens when you build teams that way. And now people are not trying to bend the rules. The culture is built the right way, and people want to be there. People are following you versus want to be dragged. Versus, authoritarian leader, nobody wants to follow them. So if you start saying back in the office, or X number of hours clocked in or whatever, people are going to start leaving, because it's easy to compare and say, well, I know there's these two companies doing a hybrid model, so something is unfair here. Why are we not like that? And fairness or unfairness is a big driver for people to make changes in their
Yeah.
career. And they usually drift towards fairness. So I think when you see models that are out there and you're like, well, that to me, that's more fair, I'm going to drift that way. And high performers are going to have a very easy time. Low performers are not. But then what's going to happen is a company is going to end up with a pool of low performers, which is bad for
Right.
business.
And that's that big risk. And, maybe somehow a company's going to be really unique. Can Amazon just attract still these? Well, maybe if they offset that loss with, what is it? Higher pay. Like, what is this thing? Because it's not enough. There's hardly enough carrots, as they've proven, because people, despite the Googles and the Netflix and other companies having these amazing perks, people are still kind of like, yeah, that's great. But it's hard to beat the perk where I'm, chilling wherever I want to chill, whether it's at home or some of them taking that on the road around the world. But you did say something in there that was interesting, though, still, about how you don't think there's a switch. But for people like you and I, like for us, the remote hasn't felt as much of a struggle. Whether that's, and what I mean by that is that because we were already operating with that mentality beforehand, because we didn't have to go through any crazy training to just acknowledge? Or is it because our fairness is so high alert on us that we always looked at it from the perspective of, what's the work getting done? And that's all we measured it on. Like, what do you think that difference is?
So this goes back even way before COVID. I want to say 13, 14 years ago. If some of my old team members are listening, they can fact check me on this. But before even Disney ever even introduced a little bit of a flexibility policy, I had gone to HR and drafted my own flexibility policy. There were other kind of peers of mine that were not happy with what I was doing because it was like, what's going on there? But I always saw it as why do I need somebody just in the office for 8 hours a day? If I can see results, and I was very diligent and methodical around what are our goals for the year? Let's review the goals every month, quarterly. Are we tracking to them? What are our metrics? How do we adjust the business metrics, or where are we going? I was very focused on this. And then I was very focused on team building and
Hmm.
culture. So those two allowed me to see where performance is good, where performance is lacking. And to me, that was the indication where somebody might need help in
Yep.
coaching, not if they were in the office. So because I had established these KPIs or indicators, it was very easy for me to say, hey man, you don't need to be in the office. Feel free today, do your thing from home, because I can see you only have 2 Zoom meetings. What's the point of coming in the office? And this is, when I say go back 14 years, Zoom
Right.
wasn't a thing. So this is, hey, you have more, a couple of conference calls, so you can take those from home. Not everybody liked what I was doing, but HR approved
Yeah.
it. And then a few years later, Disney HR policy rolled out its own flexibility policy, and obviously we know what happened when COVID hit. It was more than that. But to me, I feel like I was prepared because I was acting that way already,
Right.
with looking at performance in a very different
So,
way.
so on that then, because again, I think you and I had some similar philosophies there. For me, it was trying to introduce the first like early Friday because people were putting the hours in and leave early, which stuck for a while until there was a level of being uncomfortable with that because somebody didn't know whether somebody was getting their work done because they judged it by them being in the seats, which was, unfortunate. So as soon as I left that department, they actually stopped doing those things. But I took my own approach, like with my leadership at the time, it was very much like, they never really asked where Michael was. I never knew where Michael was because I had plenty of meetings and other things, but half the time I'd be working at a Starbucks because that was my preferred place to get my focus work done. And all they cared about was I was driving the results. But it does make me wonder here because, all right, our leadership at the time would have been of a different generation, but they did seem, to a degree, depends on which leadership we pick, comfortable with some of this. But is this a generational thing, do you think?
Some of it for sure. And when we say generational, let's just say it, baby boomers, probably most of them fall in this category. I
It's
think
what they
so.
grew up with. It's what they're used to.
It's what they grew up with, what they used to. And when you're doing it for 30, 40 years, it's hard to change people on the
Yeah.
fly. So definitely they're generational. I think there's some, I don't want to bucket everybody in that, in the baby boomer generation as, oh, they have bad habits or they're not up to current. But that's not the case. A lot of them adjusted. A lot of them had adjusted even before COVID. We had bosses that obviously were very well versed in, let's look at performance truly from results and measure
Yep.
KPIs. So, but there were some that were not that way, which then dragged everybody back because they weren't all moving forward in the same
There's
direction.
this interesting thing that I feel like ironically happens, especially when somebody hits that executive level, is at that point, then people are almost less concerned about where you are in your time because it's trusted more that you've reached this level, you must know it. And I say that's a bit blanket, but I think it's fairly true. The higher you climb up the ladder, people don't care. They just want you to get your work done. But there's this big difference still, I think, that sometimes does happen because ironically now the people who are saying come back to the office are the people who are often not in the office or traveling or doing whatever else there, which is also, I think, the other thing that loses a lot of trust because it feels hypocritical and people don't want to feel like they're like a kid back in school being told they need to get a hall pass to go out and use the restroom. But for somebody today, like a new individual coming into the workforce, I mean, what advice would you give to them? Because it's a bit of a conundrum because people are arguing that that individuals are not as good with people and skills and understanding what that looks like because they've grown up in a remote environment. What do you think about that?
So let's first kind of, I say narrow it down, but obviously it's a big population. But let's say we're talking about white collar knowledge work, because when you talk medical fields and in store retail, very different. But if you're wanting to get into white collar knowledge based careers, I would definitely lean towards remote first. But I say that with a caveat. You have to know what your goals are first. If your goals are, I want to climb to be the CEO in the C suite of a Fortune 100, 500 company, then remote first and only being remote might take a very long time for you to get there.
And you may
but
and you may not get there if the
you
yeah,
might not get, if your goal is to, hey, I have other aspirations, but I want to learn first how a big company operates. I don't want to, pay $100,000, $200,000 for an MBA because I can get that same MBA education working at a established corporation. Then yeah, go remote first, heads in, learn everything you can, network however you can. 3 4 years from then, go off and start your
yeah.
own thing. It's irrelevant. And the reason I say this is because you know sure, diversity and inclusion policies are great. Some are lip service, some are actually doing it, but none of them, I think, trump proximity bias. Proximity bias is so strong because it's human nature. So it's just natural that whoever people that are responsible for decision making for promotions and moving people up the ladder are going to lean towards who they know more and
Yeah.
who they interact with more. That has its downfall too, because if you are interacting with a senior leader who's making promotion decisions and you're not actually high performing, it's going to backfire. But those high performers are going to get, if a high performer is remote and a high performer is hybrid or in office and rubbing shoulders with senior leadership on a regular
Yeah.
basis, they will get the promotion first, 100%. I have
Yeah.
no doubt. I'm ready to debate that with anybody that wants to come on the podcast. Please comment below if you want to debate us on this, but I truly believe
I'm with you. And actually on this, I do want to link, even though it's only going to be to the waiting list, because I'm not going to open again until January, but to my program, because I help people stand out as top performers for this exact reason. And it's like, it's silly for people to go into careers. I say silly. This is obviously, I feel strongly this way, which is why I built a program out around it. But for people not to stand out as top performers in an organization, if they want to have the flexibility, if they want to have more money, which is why we're in these careers, I feel like, in the first place. Now, for all the people who are like, no, I'm good, I'm okay playing it safe over, it's just a recipe, I think, for disaster. And I think, with this, I'm really curious though, because you started off, your very first job was Carl's Jr., mine was McDonald's. And I got to say, having that in-person sort of experience and also just understanding and like seeing how things work a little bit more, call it management supervisor, in this more, I don't know, closed circuit way, I did think was very valuable. And like, I would want my kids to have some level of experience like that. Would you argue that it's not necessary today that somebody has anything like that, where they are at least experiencing those dynamics firsthand in person?
I don't think it's necessary. I think it comes back to the goals again and what you want. As a selfish parent, I'm going to say, yes, go remote. So I never experienced an empty nest. But as a
Wait until their teens are,
non-selfish,
wait till their teens. I'm just kidding.
yeah, as a non-selfish parent, where I want the best for them, I think seeing how they are at their best.
Yeah. It's a great point.
Because personality comes into play. When I look at Eric and Ava, they're very different. Eric is more of an introvert. Ava is a complete extrovert. She has no problem mingling with people. Eric has a difficult time if it's like new faces that he doesn't recognize. So depending on the personality, I would coach and guide them in the direction that best fits their personality. Now, who knows? They might change. They're only 6 and 4, so don't judge me. They're only 6 and 4, so they're going to change a lot by the time they become young adults. But I think I would still lean towards seeing their strength. Honestly, no different than if I was evaluating team members. I would see what their strengths are and coach them to take full potential and advantage of their strengths, instead of looking at their weaknesses and say, oh, you're not good here, let's help you improve here. But it's like, what's the point there? If I help you improve, I'm just making it up, if I improve your data analysis skills from 50% to 75%, where you're still nowhere close to being anywhere where the top folks are.
Yeah.
So what's the point? But if you are a really good communicator, then if I can help you become a better communicator, now you're, top of the field. So to me, that's no different how I would coach and guide kids versus, team members.
Just because you brought it to kids too, something else that's interesting to me, I think about this with workplace and just the whole idea of remote versus not, is that we homeschool our kids. And with that, the amount of time they actually have to spend on school to complete the assignments is so small compared to what it would be in school. Now, there might be other people or people who listen to this like, oh, you're homeschooling, then your kids, yeah, then you need to make sure that they're out there in the social things. And obviously there's all these things to consider. And ironically now, my kids, they'll come to, I'll call it work with me because I still go and like to work at Starbucks. They know all the employees there. And like, it's hilarious. Like, how I could see now those kids, they're actually excited to take on a job like that at some point. And, I'll embrace them doing that. But at the same time, I'm trying to teach them those remote type skills that they could also do and learn, because I could see how that's going to allow them probably more of that future, flexibility that they want. But ultimately it will be up to them. But you said early on something about the, oh, sorry, actually on that note, with that and with how much time that my kids could spend in school now. Well, some would argue in the workplace that, again, productivity can increase when somebody's not having shoulder taps all day long and when they're just measured on what they actually have to get done, which sometimes in workplaces is not very clear. It's confusing, lack of vision, poor leadership ultimately ties back to. But what do you think in the scenario where somebody is working fully remote and they're working 2 jobs? Is that a no-no? Or is it A-okay?
Obviously, it first depends on whatever agreement you signed when you accepted a job. If it's against policy, then yeah, I mean, you gotta you gotta know what you're signing up for. And the other part I would say is there's a lot of people that work multiple jobs. Are they doing it at the same time? That's the issue. And I think a good leader can probably tease out if there's performance issues going on because somebody is having back-to-back meetings, but they're for different
Right.
jobs.
Well,
If you're working 2 jobs and it's like, well, I'm going in from 7 a.m. to 4 p.m. on one job and then 5 to 10 p.m. on another job, yeah, why
but
not?
but let's go further with this. What if somebody can? If you're just measuring it based on performance? What if somebody can manage 2 jobs at the same time that are 9 to 5s? Should they be able to?
I think that's a rare exception, and if they can manage it, then probably leadership will never find out about it
Yeah,
because they're
that's true.
so good at
That's true. But
it.
you had shared something the other day about how with some of this AI too, and we've seen it. Like you're getting to a point where people can have an AI version of them show up for a meeting and possibly competent. And that is mind blowing when you start thinking about that. But let's take that back to workplace sort of things. That does become a little bit of this interesting thing where either that means your productivity could be really high because now you could also do more work for your own company and stand out as a top performer, or it starts to become this risk because if people are able to train their own versions of them to do that, well then I think more and more companies, and going back to whether or not companies are using this just to push people to quit because they don't want to have to let them go and pay them severances, because AI is having an impact, which we can have a conversation probably on another time about. But you had said you would go remote first. And for me, I would too, by the nature of meaning hiring team members as we grow our own companies. I'm going to take it back to some of the entrepreneurial roots here. I would do the same, but that's mostly a dollars and an initial, like, let's grow this concept. But as it grew, I do think that I would have a bias towards I'm going to have a bias towards who's best. And if that person's best that I had found that way, that's great. But the natural tendency could be that I happen to meet somebody in person who then I like the idea of, there is some proximity things that can happen with that would make me think, because I did enjoy, I didn't want to be in work all the time. No, honestly, I didn't want to be work 3 days a week, but I loved actually when I'd get together with the teams. We do team building, we would talk vision, we do those things. Like I thrived and I love those sort of things. I think those are really important, and I miss, those components of it. And you just don't quite get there, in this sort of way. While at the same time, individuals like you and I who have this long existing, rapport and sometimes function off of a similar brain, while yes, it'd be nice that we gave each other a big bro hug one day, it's also like, whatever, we pick up, it doesn't even feel like sometimes we're, far apart. But do you think, like, if you were to choose and you had a team, would you try to make it some sort of a hybrid approach? Or would you still say, no, I'm hiring all over the world and we'd only come together once a year?
Let's go back to 2009, 10. Our offices at Disney was probably separated by a few offices. So I can easily run down the hall and say, hey, man, I got
Yeah.
something. I ran to your office and said, hey, I think I have an idea. for tech startup around hospitality and
Uh-huh.
nightlife. I shared it with you. You're like, yeah, this is great. I'm like, okay, let's figure out how to. Well, it took us, a little bit of time to build the prototypes, and then eventually I ran away with it, and we got $4 million in funding for it. So speaking of two jobs, I
That's a
did
great
this
point.
already.
Yeah.
I had a full-time role at Disney, and then I was the CEO of a tech
Yeah.
startup. My day would start at 5 a.m. because most of the team was remote. The remoteness of the team, again, going back to 2010, 11 now, the remoteness was because it was cheaper to hire software engineers offshore. So it was by necessity. So 5 a.m. I would wake up. About 5 to 8, 8:30, I was either on the calls with them or kind of looking at whatever that sent me that needed my decision or response to. Then I would get to Disney. Those guys, in Eastern Europe and India are now sleeping. 5, 6 o'clock, I would head out of Disney, and again from like 7 o'clock to 10, 11, I was back working on the startup. So during the week, we were a full remote team. Then as it grew, we started hiring some folks, and we had LA-based team members right around us. 2 weekends out of the month, we would spend Saturday and Sunday 10 hours together. That was to basically move things forward very quickly, decide on tactical things like, hey, does this functionality work for you? Let's test it. Is this working? Is the app doing what it needs to do? And then we would also look at strategy and vision and where we're going, and marketing and branding and sales slides and PowerPoint presentation. Those things moved really fast and very effectively in person. And we did it over the weekends. So it was 3 or 4 days out of the month that we got together, 10-hour days. And then that would set us up for the next 2 weeks of fully remote work, because everybody had their marching orders. We knew exactly what we wanted to do. It was, hey, check in. Are you progressing? Anything I can help with? Anything, blocking you? And 2 weeks again, boom, come together, powwow, go off again. That model, this is way before pre-COVID and pre-pandemic. So it worked really, really well. That's exactly what I would do today, especially now the tools are even better.
But what you just said though is you would hire like your leadership, whatever we want to call it, your non-development team. That was still local. They were still within the greater Los Angeles area.
That was by accident. That wasn't
But if
by
not,
kind of.
that would mean though, are you saying you would have everybody travel? Because that still determines how far somebody should be. What if they're on the East Coast? Or would you instead say, nah, we'd have you up on a screen. It's not going to be exactly the same thing, but we would operate that way.
No, we would definitely budget for travel. And when I say we would come together on weekends, actually most of the time it wasn't in LA, because it was a hospitality and nightlife based startup. Most of our weekends were actually in Vegas, because that's where the big event. So we actually paid for travel for everybody to meet up in Vegas. We would get whatever hotel we were staying at to give us either a large suite where 7, 8, 10 people can fit in with a big room, or we would get a conference room, and that's where we would spend. And it was just right. And it's funny, Vegas actually probably made it easier for that, because people knew that, hey, I'm going to Vegas. Come into Vegas and be in a room for 10 hours.
Right.
And then it was, oh, let's go to a dinner and let's go have drinks. Like, it was a fun atmosphere.
And the software was nightlife, so
it.
that doesn't hurt. Yeah.
Yeah. So I would do exactly the same.
But the thing is, if you're doing exactly the same, again, because of the money raised in that scenario, I guess, that does allow some of the travel. If people can't, because I guess where I go, you do have companies like 37 Signals and many others that have like always been remote. And in that case, it's not that frequent that they get together, and they have still found, how to do some of their creative calls, like this. And they do it. In fact, I mean, heck, actually for me, I'll say this way. I'm building out a business now. We're about to launch the second cohort and this one's related to short-term rental marketing. My partner's in France. We've actually only met in person one time. So what we do, because of the time zone difference, is 3 days a week, we have calls that are at 1.5 to 2 hours, and then everything else is over Slack. So, and would it be nice that if we were in one room locking things down? It absolutely would be. But at the same time, we've completely made this work. So I guess for me in those scenarios, it's like, I wouldn't mind if that happened to be where my leadership or whatever was. In fact, somebody I'm building the website component of that with, and who's helping build out some of the automation around that from software, he's in Southern California. We've never met in person. So I do think, there's these scenarios, and here we are basically about to launch that product out around it. I absolutely think that people can find some models that maybe aren't as frequent. But to your point, there is something that can come out of that, which points to, I think, what Andy is trying to really capture when he tries to get people back into Amazon. Because the argument you made of doing that every other week, well, I think he feels that some parts of their business need to be in such a build mode that they need people to be together, like in this leadership one, all the time, because they're churning out these things and ideas
Yeah.
that their whole team that's then maybe around the world needs to execute on. So what would be the difference between those?
I would say, and again, there probably is data around this, and we're just going on gut feelings and experience. But if I was the CEO of a big company, instead of mandating back to office, I would mandate team building and culture building. I would say everybody must be in the office 3 times a week, and you must spend, making up the number, 5 hours on team building and culture. Like, that's what I would mandate instead of just come back to the office, because I feel like that mandate is more focused and more reason. Like, there's a reason behind it. Like, it's clear. When a mandate is just come back to the office, it feels like you're being treated as a kid and saying, hey, I don't trust you. Come back here so you could do what we can watch what you're doing. That's kind of what it feels like to the majority of the population. So that's kind of what I would do. I would put on mandates that are different and more focused around the real reason why that in-face human interaction actually is beneficial.
On that, there was a couple of interesting stats that just came out in some, I think, LA Times article, which talked about how there's this disconnect between what maybe some senior leadership is saying about back to office versus what's actually happening. And I think it's because those in middle management are often, whether it's generational or whether it's just that they're like, yo, but the reality here, is here's what I'm looking at, or here's what I realize is going to lose me talent. And they're basically saying that 60% of leader surveys said they want their employees in the office 3 or more days a week, while only 51% reported that employees work in the office of that frequency. So they're saying, we want you in here, but then people aren't necessarily reinforcing it. And I think, again, it's because they're like, either why it's not necessary, or it could also be, I'm not going to rub my employee wrong and lose them because they don't know how to navigate it. And then conversely, it says 37% of employees show up 1 or 2 days a week, yet only 17% of employers are satisfied with the attendance. So needless to say, it is a struggle. And I'm just curious to get your thoughts on that real quick. Why do you think there is that disconnect?
It's hard to police this. Like, how do you, and I think that's probably why full-time back in the office is easier to police, because it's like, okay, it's 100%. I think hybrid is hard to police, like who's coming in, who's going, especially if you have, over the last couple of years, reduced your office footprint. And it's very tricky to coordinate. We have a department of 200, but only seats for 100. Well, how do you play musical chairs to coordinate this? It just becomes just a headache. And then for somebody that's trying to book, hoteling cubicles or whatever you're doing, it's such a pain in the ass to do that. So you gotta forget it. I don't want to come into this. I'm more productive in my own seat at home. It's hard to police. And I think that's why most companies are going to have a very hard time policing their policies unless they do full time. And then it's like, okay, but then that has its own other backlashes. Yeah. What I said in the beginning around mindset shift and leadership, to me, I think that's the answer. It's not an easy solution because it takes time to figure those things out. But if performance indicators and what does results look like are clear, then you march towards that. And to me, that becomes your policing. Instead of policing butts in the seats, you police results.
Which is how it should have always been, realistically. I mean, you motivate people that way. You motivate people to come up with better ways to do the work, which then leads to better productivity. And I, I think, you know,
The other thing is, some of them I think might be because there is, and this I've never been in HR or any type of that side of the company, but a company like Netflix has a much easier time saying, we don't like performance, bye bye, versus a company like Disney, where, my God, firing somebody is like, that person has to do something so bad to kind of be fired. I think when it's really, really hard to fire somebody, it just becomes harder to look at performance and say, well, I don't know, well, business goals were met. Is it enough to let this person? So I think you have to, some of these companies have to go back to their roots and say, are we even, can we even change those policies? Like, are we willing to take some of the legal backlash and some of the legal lawsuits that might come on because we fired
yeah,
somebody, and be okay with it, in hopes of, let's be, results
the
driven?
irony there is, for a company like Disney, is really the answer in many ways actually to those same problems is coming down to really clear expectations, which isn't always clear. Not all leaders are making that as clear. And again, I'm saying that blanket. Some do it really well, some don't do it well. But the bottom line is you're right. You had to build up this crazy case for a while. And the case felt hard at times because it's like, did people get really clear on what those expectations were? And I think there's a great book for anybody to read on this, whether they're aspiring entrepreneurs or in the workplace, called Traction, because it really breaks down like what is everybody, what's the number that everybody's accountable for, and what specifically, are like those big, they call them rocks, but goals that somebody's targeting, because they set those up quarterly, and then everybody has a measurement that ties back to completing that. And I think that's how every organization, and definitely somebody, sure, early day startup, it's a little bit weird because, everybody's wearing multiple hats, but you should still have these clear things you're trying to get to. And the most important thing to get you, in essence, to your first, sales. And I think that is critical. And I would definitely recommend that as a book that people pick up. And really, in general, I think for anybody who's building a company, it's like, just be super clear on what people's roles are, be super clear on what they're responsible for, and be super clear to them about how that ties towards the overall company goals. And if people can align, that vision with these specific goals and then measurables around that, so that person can also get that feedback, like, that could resolve so many different things. And then it doesn't just become back down to, were you in your seat? Because that's how they sometimes, measure performance. It almost goes back to assembly line days of, maybe that's what it took on when you were working a conveyor belt, having to move things, along, because by the nature of it, you had to keep up with the conveyor belt. Well, conveyor belt dates are gone, and people have to figure that out. But I wanted to touch,
Yeah.
oh, go ahead. One more thing after.
Can I touch on
Yeah.
that? Actually, I think what you said, and then you have to add, set expectations for accountability, and then hold people accountable quickly and fast.
Yeah.
Don't drag
Agree.
on. Like, when you're building a company, you don't have time and money to waste on somebody that's not meeting expectations. Set expectations for, hey, this is what we're doing, and we're going to hold people accountable. And at the first sign that something is going off, hold somebody accountable. We made the mistake on the startup where somebody was hired based on their previous track record, but a relationship to somebody else in the company.
Yeah.
And very quickly, I noticed, this is not going right. I went to my investment team. I said, hey, guys, we got to get rid of him. They're like, no, 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 no. There's a relationship here. And I was right. It took us like 7 months to figure this out. But my gut feeling was 100% right. If we had acted
Yeah.
right away when I said, this is not going the right direction, this needs to change, we would have saved so much time and money. And I feel like when you're starting a business, you got to be, take time to hire, but be very quick on getting rid of somebody. Yeah. It's not that they're a bad person. It's just that they're a bad fit for your team and culture at that moment in time.
And again, this book Traction, just to sort of recommend, it goes into the idea of that and people in the right roles too. And by the way, as your company grows, somebody may no longer be the right fit as well. And you got to be able to acknowledge that, because as the role changes, they may not be able to adapt quickly enough to it. And there's this fine balance between how much you help them grow and support them growing. And, I do think that I'm a believer in that, but again, to this degree, because you can't let your job become trying to train this person, especially if you were never equipped to do that in the first place. But 100% agree with you. I want to ask a question on mental health, though, and what that means, though, because during, the pandemic, a lot of people talked about, well, it wasn't healthy for people to be at home. But then there's the other coin of it that says, well, for some of these people who struggle a little more in the social environments, is that bad for their mental health? So what do you think the impact is on any of this to mental health? Because it doesn't sound like there's one clear answer.
How the brain actually functions and how people suffer or not suffer. I'm just going to fall back on my personal experience. I whether it's remote or not remote, I've always found a way to figure out how to be the best that I can be, and whether it's my own startup or company or as an employee, to make sure goals and objectives are being met, and whoever that I need to interact with, that's happening. And personally, for my own career growth, I'm interacting with the right people. So I took ownership of it. If isolation is an issue, then yeah, do something about it. I don't think anybody is. I don't think anybody will fight you to say, I need to come to the office. People will be like, yeah, sure, come on. So I do think there's some sense of ownership that people have to take around their
Yeah.
own, wellness. But if the ownership that you take and the things you want to do are now against company policy, that's where I think the challenge comes in. So if you need to be more remote because young kids, caring for somebody, just the way you work, you have a lot of anxiety around large groups of people, but now you're being forced into that environment that you don't operate well with. Yeah, that's probably where now you need to make a change, because for your own mental wellness, you need to be in an environment that's good for you. And you only know what that environment is. I don't think anybody can put that on you.
Well put. I think, again, there's this fine balance here between somebody pushing himself a little bit out of their own comfort zone or not. Like, I do know that I've had some team members who also would have preferred to stay in a room all day long with as part of their role. But at the same time, eventually, little by little, because they also had other aspirations, they were able to, they did push some of those anxieties aside and were.
Yeah. And don't get me wrong, I'm all for that. I think some people don't know
We get used to certain things
how
too.
they can stretch themselves. Yeah, they get comfortable and they don't know how to stretch
Yeah.
themselves. And those people, with a little bit of a nudge, not only you as a leader, but them as a team member, can see like, oh wow, there is a next level to this person. They're capable of more, and I'm all for that. But again, there's a fine balance of how much you push somebody, where now it's truly a mental
And it's a
wellness
matter
issue.
of somebody who are they in the back to right role again too. If somebody finds themselves in a sales and marketing role and they hate people, chances are they're not in that right
Exactly.
role. Yeah. So, um, so final sort of thought on Amazon. Do you actually think that they're going to reverse this?
No, I don't think they're going to reverse it. I think they're going to roll with this. When I say reverse, I don't think they're going to reverse it right away. I think they're going to go with what Andy Jassy has said. They're going to go full remote. It's going to be hard to police. There's going to be pockets where they're going to come up with their own hybrid models, because they can, because Amazon is, global company. They'll lose high performers. They'll also lose low performers. And then over time, I feel like they might come back to reestablishing some kind of a hybrid model. And after looking at data, because Amazon being such a data-driven company, this could be a good way to actually see real data around what happens. It's a big gamble, but unfortunately, sometimes big companies, everyone is dispensable. So no matter if you're a high performer, so this might be a way to very quickly look at what the future should look like in a data-driven way.
And because again, the bet that they are currently making, or that Andy is making, is that this will actually give the company the edge long term. That's what he believes, because he's going to do exactly what you were saying you did every other weekend. He's going to do that all the time because he believes that will work. I just think there's a difference between, what you apply at the strategy level versus maybe what you apply at every other level, and whether or not people are going to constantly, because you guys, the team couldn't have functioned at that level all the time either, of every other weekend, because you need these times in between, those, I don't know, call it creative go sessions to then, implement, decompress, et cetera, et cetera. So I will be curious to see what happens. I too think that there's a big risk to it. I already see some of the people are losing. If anything, I think what this invites is a future conversation where we talk about how is this more the beginning of people, these top performers going out and starting their own business in a day of AI and other things where they're just like, you know what, screw this. Why am I working for somebody else who wants to police me like I'm in school again? And I think actually it's going to probably accelerate. When people talked about the gig economy before, I think you're going to find a lot of people standing up their own solopreneurships and smaller operations now, which ironically, what will probably happen is companies like Amazon will come back and buy from them.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, if you guys agree or disagree, let us know. In fact, specifically, tell us whether or not you think what Andy's doing is a big mistake, or if you think that Amazon, which is, one of the biggest companies in the world, is going to continue to thrive and build and do amazing things. Maybe this is not even going to be something that anybody notices, but what do you think? Do you think this is going to be beneficial, or it's going to hurt them in the long run? And otherwise,
yeah, we'd love to hear what you think. Drop the comments below.
And if you enjoyed this episode, we also think you will enjoy this one.